United Nations University's Institute for the Environment and Human Security. Today's topic is the state of play on climate insurance and is there progress at COP23. There are, of course, pressing reasons why we chose this topic for today's press briefing. Around the world, countries are already experiencing the effects of climate change. And while there is agreement that mitigation is crucial, we also have to face the reality that extreme weather due to climate change is already leading to loss and damage and will continue to do so. Often, these losses affect the most vulnerable populations. It is for these reasons that climate insurance has received increasing attention in international policy processes, because it can serve as a tool to protect these populations, to help them recover after an impact, and to become better prepared. Today's press briefing will analyze major developments in the field of climate insurance and will also provide perspectives from the point of view of vulnerable countries and the private sector. Our speakers are Soenke Kreft, the Executive Director of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, Sara Jane Ahmed, Climate Financial Advisor at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities in the Philippines, and Simone Ruiz-Vergote, Managing Director at Allianz Climate Solutions. I will now ask each participant to give an opening statement. After the statements, there will be time for questions from the audience. I would like to ask Soenke to begin. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Nadine, for the kind introduction, and also hello to everyone that is here in the room and that is following us online. I'm Soenke Kreft. I'm leading a group of experts from the insurance industry, from NGO sector, from academia and international organizations. And what we try to do is we try to figure out what can be the role of insurance in the fight against climate change, especially on adaptation. It's called climate insurance. It's a topic of the climate negotiations for a very long time, and it actually was brought on the agenda by the small island states as early as 1992. The technology then. Yeah. So Nadine already introduced you the relevance of the topic, and this is some data I took actually from Munich Re, one of the largest reinsurers in the world. I could have taken several graphs, one around the numbers of events, and what you see is that especially the climatic events in the past 30 years are increasing in absolute numbers. Here I took a graph in terms of the damages, and what you see is that there's a continuous increase in terms of economic damage around the globe, partially as a result of changing development patterns, but also partially as a result, we think, in terms of a different hazard load. And what you see is the most expensive year so far has been 2005. If the insurance industry didn't yet calculate the damage for 2017, but if you see some of the events coming through, we are on a track that 2017 will actually become the most expensive years in terms of natural catastrophes. If you actually look at how different countries are exposed to this issue, you'll find that in terms of human toll, most of the damages and most of loss of life is in the least developed country. You should definitely see the equity aspects in there. In terms of absolute damage, you would expect that economic damage to occur in the developed world, and this is certainly true. But in terms also how it's covered through insurance mechanisms, you see that it's basically it's a graph in the right bottom corner, and that is basically only the developed world that can make use of this mechanism. And this is a problem, and because there are not many mechanisms to proactively manage such events. Otherwise, you have to do ex-post strategies such as using your assets, taking out loans, etc. So this is called the protection gap, and it's one of our main motivators to work. Luckily, there has been there have been some progress at the international level, namely the G7 commitment of insure resilience with the goal of providing cover for 400 million additional people by 2020. We also have seen it being anchored in the Paris Agreement itself with the clearinghouse for risk transfer and the Warsaw International Mechanism. And this year in Hamburg, we have seen a G20 acknowledgement on a global partnership for climate and disaster risk finance. And we also see like a bottom-up case to some of the regions establishing regional risk pools such as Africa Risk Capacity. This Tuesday, we've actually launched a paper looking also at the different NDCs, so the climate implementation plans of the countries in the context of the Paris Agreement. And what you see that in 38 countries, this is there's one of their strategies to adapt to climate change. So I think there is a bottom-up case, and we can provide you with a document after the event. Lastly, what are the next steps necessary for this kind of agenda? And I think we have some momentum in the bilateral and multilateral world, but I think we have to broaden that impact. And there are different ways to do that. One is, of course, increase the support, but we also have to follow through with the commitments that have been made. We have to ensure there's a poor focus in that. And so far, there's no partnership institutionalized, only acknowledged. It's something to expect for next week. But of course, this partnership will then really have to work on the crucial questions. For example, how to reach poor and vulnerable people. Then on the national governments, this is the main responsibility, of course, to make the strategies to fit in climate risk insurance so that it makes sense to do to provide the enabling conditions. But also in the next kind of iteration to use to have a more systematic approach how to use climate risk insurance in the context of NDCs. And lastly, COP23 and the UNFCCC, I think we have to operationalize the support structures for climate insurance in the UNFCCC. It's mainly the clearinghouse to be launched probably also next week. And we also have to anchor it in the Warsaw Mechanism 5-year work plan to have some kind of meaningful guidance to countries coming out of that process. And lastly, the issue, of course, is to organize the support for loss and damage and specifically for climate risk insurance, and also to make sure that public money is mostly used towards the most vulnerable countries and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Soenke. I would now like to give the floor to Sara.
Yep, thank you. I'll just wait for my slides to come on. I'll just start. Yep. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I work closely with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, which is an advisor to the Philippines as a member of the Troika of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, commonly known as CVF. The CVF is an advocacy cooperation of governments representing over 40 vulnerable countries, including Fiji, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. We need innovative and market-based solutions in insurance, financial products, and business models to support low-carbon and climate-resilient development across vulnerable countries. For our part, we are developing an Islamic finance-related insurance facility designed to increase the bankability of bottom-up transformational projects in vulnerable countries. The founding of the Vulnerable 20 Group of Finance Ministers, or V20, in October 2015 acknowledged the need for much-needed, highly accessible, dependable, and cost-efficient insurance that incentivizes upscaled mitigation and adaptation measures. In April 2016, the V20 recognized that extending insurance coverage represents tremendous opportunities for increasing economic resilience. A V20 study the same year indicated that just 14% of the 1 billion population of CVF members had access to existing catastrophe and risk mechanisms, or less than 10% of the GDP of member economies. We need financing and de-risking facilities that unlock investment in critical infrastructure assets outlined in the vulnerable country-led climate infrastructure blueprints, including the urban services, transport, water, energy, sustainable landscapes, and ocean and coastal ecosystems. Vulnerable countries deserve not only to survive, but to thrive. People normally think of insurance in the survive mode, but what we are doing here is to rethink insurance to enable the thriving of our vulnerable countries. We should not choose between development and climate action. Climate action is better for development, and we see that today with the systematic cost deflation of renewable energy. We must use innovative financing and insurance to close the slow onset and fast onset event protection gap. We must incentivize adaptation and disaster risk reduction measures, and we must promote low-carbon infrastructure investments. We invite institutional investors such as Allianz and other insurance companies, pension funds and foundations, governments and development partners to invest in and collaborate with the vulnerable country-led sustainable insurance and TACA facility. For more information, please do come to our event on innovative finance on Monday. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I will now give the floor to Simone.
Thank you. Still digesting all the input that Sarah just put to the table, and of course also requiring or asking for a response from the insurance sector. I work for Allianz Climate Solutions. Allianz Climate Solutions is a subsidiary of Allianz Group. I'm also responsible for the climate strategy of Allianz Group, and since 2 years we started developing the approach for scaling insurance solutions for developing countries. It's not an easy approach in the sense that you actually really need to look at an increasingly challenging problem, because most of the developing world is actually highly exposed to the impacts of climate change, and you can see this already today. So you anticipate more impacts in the future. Just between 1980 and 2016, the developing and emerging economies accounted for 10% of potential uninsured losses, but just 1% of insured losses. And this is a tenfold gap. So as you have seen this year, we had a particularly heavy hurricane season. And we just talked to our California office. Our California office was affected by wildfires they have not seen before. They had to have a business continuity plan. They were evacuated for 10 days. They couldn't work out of the poor air quality, while they had to settle the insurance claims coming from the south of the country. So you see the challenges that we are operating on a more local level. And of course, they are replicated around the world. So if you look at insurance and what a role insurance can actually play to mitigate the impacts of natural catastrophes, I see three different ones, and I liked, Sarah, what you just said. You wanted insurance to be accessible, dependable, and cost efficient. I believe, in fact, the dependability and accessibility is a crucial criteria. Right now, there is often no insurance available. There is simply no one you can turn to. At the conference last year in the Philippines, I was asked by an island state representative, I won't name now, but can you not please insure my island against rising sea level? And the answer is no, because it's a clear and predictable risk, and the price you would pay to insure this island would be just too expensive. So there need to be other measures. What we can insure, however, is frequently occurring events that have a very high damage, or say frequent from maybe not every day, but maybe every 20, every 30 years. And ideally, actually, events that occur even less frequently but have a higher damage. And that's these events that you are just not able to shoulder as a state, as a household, as a farmer, and that actually would risk your existence. So these are the areas where we come in. And this all to say that insurance is just one part of the whole picture. Insurance without starting with risk reduction in the very first place is not a good solution. We're currently in conversation with the GIZ to extend the partnership we were having with them for the past 5 years on microinsurance, to look more at the meso level, so say cities, communities, maybe industrial hubs, to look at what actually is the exposure to flood and how can these actors improve their resilience to such floods. So if you look at a city that has been inundated for every year almost for the last 5 years with a 100-year flood event that would normally occur, probabilistically speaking, only every 100 years, well, you need to look at what you can do to protect your peoples from such water masses coming down from the sky. And one of the approaches we are pursuing is to look at the catalogue of the public infrastructure at risk, and then looking precisely where the water is coming down, having a better measurement in place, and improving just the way the city is really dealing with such events. You can call it maybe a health check, and you start with that. And at the very end of the process, you look at what actually you can insure, and then you place this into a market and you have the best available cover, ideally with some support, especially for those people that just cannot afford an insurance cover otherwise. The advantage of insurance is, of course, that you do not need to rely on dramatic pictures. You don't have the delay that you usually see when international aid is just required to help a country come back to on its feet after a natural disaster. You have, in fact, a speed of response. We have seen this with the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Facility. This year they had almost 50 million in payout for a couple of islands that were devastated after the hurricanes, and the money was paid out in just 14 days. I don't think we have seen a similar success in international aid deployment in any other part in the world. Just to conclude, as we speak about mobilizing these approaches and these solutions also for the very poor that often have simply no recourse to take when an extreme event hits. I think we need to make sure that there is the understanding of what an insurance can actually enable. That's a gap here. It's one of awareness, but it's also one of enabling them to access such instruments. And for that, there is only one way. The insurance sector needs, in fact, to partner with the public sector and the other way around. We need civil society at the table to ensure that the money reaches these people and is not diverted in government covers or other dark places. We need transparency, and I think here MCI is playing an enormously important role. And looking forward to the negotiation process, I think it is not a panacea, so insurance solutions should not be the only instrument in the discussion, and it should not replace the need to engage in financial support under the loss and damage mechanism. So I conclude here. I think it's a potentially very powerful instrument if it's mobilized, but you need to place it into the full context of risk reduction frameworks. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panel for these very diverse contributions from different perspectives. I would now like to open the floor for questions. I would like to ask you to please raise your hand and state your name and the outlet you are working for. We would like to ask to start with media questions here. However, if you are watching our press briefing on the live stream, we are happy to answer your questions too. In that case, we would ask you to tweet using the MCII hashtag that you can see in the front here, and then we'll get to your questions as well. Okay, who has the first question?
Hello, Kathy from USA Radio. And being a Texan, I have seen the devastation in Houston, and I've seen the people pull together. I've seen the insurance come into play. And my question is, what I'm seeing here is very different. You know, in the States and in most of the Western world, people own property. When they own property, which is something that you're not going to be able to fix with insurance, then they have a pride in ownership, and they take care of the property, they make improvements upon the property, and they buy insurance. This is how the system has to work because that's how human nature works. But what I'm hearing you say is that you want the developed world to pay for infrastructure because people don't have property rights and they don't have ownership. So can you please talk to that contrast between those who have been devastated, who have ownership in insurance, and those who have no ownership and no insurance?
You're absolutely right, and I think it's a discussion we're having also on the role then of subsidies to make the premium affordable for those who own nothing. In fact, maybe have a hut somewhere or a shabby place in a suburb. So I think this is a question, because the fact is, if you are not paying for any of the risk exposure you're facing, you are maybe inclined to take more risks. So we have seen constructions or extension of cities, urban sprawl. Even in Houston, we have seen it into places that should not be built on because they are floodplains. And so this is, of course, something that if you have zero price, and the price doesn't reflect any form of risk, you are incentivizing perverse behavior or adverse behavior, and that's not the idea. It's not enhancing resilience, it's reducing resilience. So this is a point to take into account. And other than that, you're right. The moment you own something, you take care of it, but even if you own nothing, you still have a family you want to protect. And I would think that the motivation should be about the same, to not seek maximum risk.
Quick answer on that. I concur with Simone, only to say that in some instances we have to balance the risk reduction signal also with humanitarian principles. For example, I mean, we are always thinking about how social safety nets, for example, can work together or complement these kind of insurance arrangements that we are trying to promote. That's one response. The other response is you tied insurance to assets, and I think Simone already answered that to some extent, but I think many of these poor people, they have a livelihood to lose, and there's also a potential case for insurance to actually provide that kind of buffer after an event, so that not the whole livelihood is lost. We call it livelihood protection policy in the Caribbean as a social product, which is already in the market, and which we try to make a sustainable business model around that. It's just one of the concrete experience that can help picture this problem.
I've got short response, and that's exactly why for vulnerable countries, the NDC, the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, is our industrial and our economic resilience strategy, because we need economic growth to survive and to thrive as well. So what we would like to see from the insurance is to actually de-risk investment, and in order to drive in that private sector investments in infrastructure and in resilience. And we do have an opening for that, because right now the developed country equity markets are at an all-time high. It means it's expensive to actually buy. Your return will not yield as much as you invest. The bond markets are actually yielding negative returns right now for investors. So the development opportunities, the investment opportunities are in these vulnerable countries, but there are risks, and that's where we need de-risking facilities to ensure that we drive that private sector investment to ensure that we will be able to survive and thrive at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from media outlets before we move on to anybody else? Mm-hmm.
Shall I shout it out? Oh, here it is. Okay. And the camera can see me. It seems to us that social science has said that insurance can play a mitigative role. As you've quite properly said, if risk increases, insurance is going to back away. Well, all the evidence from science, from UNEP and from WMO, is that risk is just rocketing into the air. And even with Paris fully implemented, the 2C budget for carbon is gone in 18 years, so that's not a long time. Why not turn your expertise in selling health insurance, retirement insurance, own your own home insurance, and so on, to the high emitters? 10% of the world's population causes 50% of the emissions. So you could argue to them that your children, your future is going to be toast, so why don't you now get insurance for mitigation, the money of which will be used to mitigate here in Germany, all across Europe, and in America? Excuse me?
Mitigate emissions.
Yeah, to mitigate emissions, in other words, the same idea. If you want security for your future, then act for the future, spend the money now. And the point would be to do that in the high per capita emitting countries because they are doing the climate changing, and that would reduce the risk globally.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay. I think you're totally right. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we say, no, start me the other way around. Insurance is a mechanism whereby you price risks and you get an assessment on the cost of certain risks. And I think that's an important starting point for the debate that you're also alluding to. And I think as a second step, the industrialized world is responsible for a large part of these risks. So we are saying that climate risk insurance, as conceptualized also here on the climate talks and in cooperation, needs also to be an avenue to basically help those most affected from climate change. And yes, we say that industrialized countries need to contribute based on the rationale that you were just saying.
Just to add, I think the first point you made about the risk skyrocketing is one that is clearly on our radar. However, it's a slow trend. We usually sell insurances for a year. So we are always able to get out of a contract if risks come really bad. But I don't think this is a good solution here. I mean, you want to be with your customer and help him out of the worst, and that worst might get worse indeed. What we have seen, though, is that in the developing world, only 98% of damages are 2% of damages only are insured. So the risk exposure we're having in this part of the world is almost zero. So if you look at it from when we insure really big risks, we like it to be regionally diversified. So you might have a drought in Mali, but you might have a flood event in Nigeria. So this is diversification for us, and we can handle these risks quite well because we understand them and we understand how the risks change. That means also we can price them, and at worst you might have an increase in the premium over time. So that's one thing. On the other topic you mentioned, I think it's one of social redistribution and of equity, and I guess you need a political framework for that. Yeah? I don't think you can volunteer the insurance customers in the developed world to add to their premium unless you regulate it. I mean, it couldn't be Allianz and then Munich Re has the same tariff, and then you can imagine what they choose. Yeah, so it has to be. We are in a competitive environment here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. We are out of time, unfortunately. Again, we welcome you to submit questions via Twitter, and thank you and have a nice day. Bye.